When I first inherited my uncle's old house, I wasn't sure if I should feel grateful or terrified. It was a sprawling Victorian estate, tucked away at the edge of a forest, its gabled roofs and peeling paint giving it the look of something from a Gothic novel. I hadn't seen the place in years, not since I was a child, and stepping through its creaking doors felt like stepping into another world. The house was packed with his belongings, untouched and layered with dust. It smelled of old wood and faint decay, as though the years had settled into the very walls. Most of it I recognized from my visits as a boy. The enormous library lined with bookshelves, the narrow, spiraling staircase leading to the attic, and the heavy oak furniture that seemed too big for any normal-sized house. But the envelope was new. I found it in the study, lying on the desk where my uncle used to write his endless letters. My name was written on the front in his familiar spidery handwriting, and inside was a single brass key and a note. For the room at the end of the east wing. Do not enter unless it calls to you. The room. I hadn't thought about it in years, but the memory came rushing back. As a kid, I'd always been drawn to that door. It was small, tucked away at the very end of a dark hallway, and it had no knob, only a strange, round keyhole. My uncle had always been adamant. Never try to open that door, boy. It's not for you. At the time, his warning had seemed almost magical, the kind of thing adults said to make things sound mysterious. But now, holding the key in my hand, I felt something else. Dread. I should have left it alone. I should have locked the key away and never thought about it again. But the pull was immediate, undeniable. I told myself I was just curious, that I needed to know what was inside for the sake of practicality. After all, it was my house now. Every room, every corner, it all belonged to me. But when I made my way to the east wing, it didn't feel like it belonged to me at all. The hallway was darker than I remembered, even in the daylight. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the air smelled damp, almost moldy. At the end of the hall, the door waited, its surface untouched by time, the wood smooth and dark. I hesitated, the brass key cold in my hand. My uncle's words echoed in my head. Do not enter unless it calls to you. And then, as if in answer, I heard it, a faint whisper, soft and distant, coming from beyond the door. The whisper was barely audible, like the rustling of leaves on a still night. It didn't sound like a voice exactly, but it carried an unmistakable pull, as though it was meant for me and me alone. I stood frozen at the end of the hallway, the key trembling in my hand. I told myself it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the old house. I even tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and shaky. The whisper came again, more insistent this time, a soft, beckoning hum that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, I stepped closer to the door. The air grew colder as I approached, each step accompanied by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. By the time I reached the door, the cold was biting, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. The door itself was strange. It didn't match the rest of the house. The wood was dark and polished, without a single scratch or blemish. Intricate carvings spiraled around the frame, patterns that seemed almost organic, like vines twisting and curling into shapes I couldn't quite recognize. The keyhole gleamed faintly, as if it had been polished recently. I delayed my fingers tightening around the brass key. My uncle's warning rang in my head again. Do not enter unless it calls to you. Was this what he meant? Had he known the door would call? My curiosity won out over my fear. Slowly, I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the metal gliding into place with a soft click. The moment I turned the key, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and the cold seemed to deepen, seeping into my bones. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was empty. At least that's what I thought at first. The walls were bare, painted a pale, peeling gray, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. A single, narrow window let in a sliver of weak light, casting long shadows across the floor. But as I stepped further inside, I noticed something strange. The room didn't feel empty. The air was thick, almost tangible, and it seemed to press down on me from all sides. My ears rang faintly, a high-pitched hum that grew louder the closer I moved to the center of the room. Then I saw it. Etched into the floorboards was a symbol carved deep into the wood. It was intricate and unfamiliar, a swirling pattern that seemed to twist and shift when I looked at it too long. The whispering returned, louder now, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the symbol. The whispering grew louder, weaving through the air like a living thing. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, pressing against my ears, filling the room with an unseen weight. I crouched down, staring at the symbol carved into the floorboards. It wasn't just a pattern. It was alive, shifting and curling in ways that defied logic. The lines seemed to pulse faintly, like veins carrying an unseen current, their glow barely perceptible in the dim light. "Hello," I whispered, though I didn't know who or what I was speaking to. The whispers responded, rising in intensity, overlapping until they became a single, clear voice. "You've come." I jerked back, scrambling to my feet. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The room felt smaller now, the air colder. The shadows cast by the narrow window seemed to stretch and twist, clawing toward me like living things. The voice spoke again, soft and deliberate. "We've waited. I repeated, my back pressed against the wall. "What do you mean, we?" The symbol pulsed, brighter this time, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. My head swam, and I gripped the edge of the window sill to steady myself. "You answered the call," the voice continued. "You opened the door." The brass key in my pocket felt impossibly heavy, as though it was dragging me toward the floor. "This is my house," I said, my voice shaking. I didn't answer anything. I was just curious. The whispering returned, louder and more chaotic, overlapping voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made my chest tighten. The symbol on the floor pulsed again, brighter, and I noticed something horrifying. The lines were spreading. They crept outward, etching themselves into the floorboards, crawling toward the walls like a spreading infection. I turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, smooth and unbroken, as if the door had never existed. "No," I whispered, panic surging through me. "This isn't happening." The voice grew louder, closer, its tone sharper now. "You cannot leave." The room began to hum, a deep vibration that rattled my bones. The symbol on the floor burned brighter, the lines stretching further, reaching toward my feet. And then in the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest, peeled itself away from the wall, unfolding like a broken marionette. Its form was indistinct, shifting and writhing, but its eyes, hollow and glistening, locked onto me. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The whispering spoke for it. "You will finish what he began." The shadow stepped forward, its movements jagged and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Each step sent the whispering into a frenzy, the overlapping voices swirling in a chaotic rhythm that burrowed into my thoughts. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What do you want?" I demanded, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. The shadow didn't answer, but the voices did. "The seal is broken." "What seal?" I shouted, my hands trembling as I groped for something. Anything, to defend myself. I didn't break anything. The lines on the floor glowed brighter, their twisting patterns now etched into the walls, creeping upward like veins. The room shuddered, and the cold deepened, sinking into my skin and chilling me to the bone. The shadow stopped a few feet from me, its form shifting and pulsing, as if it were struggling to stay contained. Its hollow eyes bored into mine, and for the first time, I felt it, something reaching into my mind, sifting through my thoughts like pages in a book. "You opened the door," the voices said in unison, louder now, almost deafening. "You called us?" "No," I yelled, shaking my head. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The shadow tilted its head, its jagged edges flickering like static. Its hollow eyes narrowed, and the air around it seemed to ripple. The voices softened, becoming almost sympathetic. It is too late now. I glanced down at the symbol, the pulsing lines now glowing so brightly they cast sharp, jagged shadows across the room. The etchings seemed to twist in time with the whispers, their patterns shifting and realigning into shapes that made my head throb. The shadow reached out, its long, distorted arm stretching toward me. Its touch wasn't physical. It was worse. A wave of cold rushed through me, and suddenly, I wasn't in the room anymore. I saw flashes, images that didn't make sense. A man, hunched over the very same symbol, carving it into the floor with shaking hands. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with desperation. My uncle. The room was darker then, filled with more shadows, their forms circling him like predators. He was saying something, muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I saw the door slam shut, sealing him inside. The vision dissolved, and I was back in the room, the shadow looming over me. My knees gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, the keys slipping from my pocket and clattering onto the glowing lines. The whispers surged, almost triumphant. "You will finish what he could not." "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't even know what he was doing." The shadow didn't move, but the lines on the floor did. They shifted and coiled, forming a new pattern, a doorway. The voices spoke again, cold and final. "You will open it." The glowing lines twisted and writhed, forming a shape that was both intricate and terrifying. A doorway etched into the floor itself. The edges pulsed with a pale, sickly light, and the air around it shimmered, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The shadow loomed over me, its jagged form still and expectant, its hollow eyes fixed on the key that lay in the center of the glowing doorway. "You will open it," the voices repeated, their tone like a cold wind slicing through my thoughts. "I don't know how," I cried, my voice trembling. "I don't even know what this is." The whispers softened, almost mocking. "It has already begun." I crawled backward, my hands scraping against the rough floorboards. My eyes darted to the walls, where the glowing lines continued to spread, twisting into patterns that defied reason. They seemed to pulse in time with the pounding in my chest, a rhythm that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. The shadow took another step forward, its distorted limbs dragging against the floor, and the doorway pulsed brighter, casting flickering shadows across the room. I had to get out. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and ran to where the door had been. My hands pressed against the smooth, unbroken wall, frantically searching for any trace of an escape. The whispers rose again, louder now, their overlapping voices filling the room like a storm. "There is no escape." I spun around, my back against the wall, as the shadow reached toward the key. Its elongated fingers hovered just above the metal, and the light around the doorway flared violently, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the shadow was gone. But the key wasn't. It floated above the doorway now, spinning slowly, its brass surface glowing with the same unnatural light that filled the room. The whispers quieted, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through my chest. I couldn't move. The light from the key held me in place, its glow growing brighter, hotter, until it felt like it was burning into my skin. And then the voices spoke again. "Open the way." The room shuddered, and the doorway began to change. The glowing lines deepened, their light warping into something darker, more malevolent. The floor beneath it seemed to dissolve, revealing a swirling void that pulsed with the same sickly rhythm. I felt a pull, invisible hands dragging me toward the doorway. "No!" I screamed, digging my heels into the floor. "I won't do it." The whispers grew sharper, angrier. "You will." The pull intensified, and I was dragged to the edge of the doorway, the void beneath me churning with shadows and light. The key hovered just out of reach, spinning faster and faster, and I realized with a sickening certainty what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to take it. "I won't," I shouted again, tears streaming down my face. But the shadow's voice cut through the chaos, calm and certain. You already have. The key stopped spinning, its glow dimming as it dropped into my outstretched hand. The moment my fingers closed around it, the doorway erupted with light. The light from the doorway was blinding, a searing white that swallowed the room and burned against my skin. I tried to drop the key, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It pulsed in my hand, growing hotter with each second, the brass surface branding itself into my palm. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that filled my head. "The way is open." "No," I screamed, but the words were lost in the roar of the light. The doorway beneath me shifted, its swirling void darkening, deepening. Shapes began to emerge from the churning shadows, twisted, writhing forms that defied logic, their edges blurred and shifting as though they weren't bound by the same rules of reality. The shadow that had loomed over me was gone, its presence replaced by something far worse. From the void, a single massive figure began to rise. Its form was indistinct, its body composed of the same shifting, writhing substance as the void itself. It was both solid and not, its jagged edges flickering and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. And then it opened its eyes. They weren't eyes in the human sense. There were no pupils, no irises, just two immense orbs of glowing light that burned with an intensity that pierced straight through me. The whispers grew clearer, their voices weaving together into a single, commanding tone. "You will bring us through." The light from the doorway pulsed again, brighter than before, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me toward the edge. My feet scraped against the floor, but there was nothing to hold on to. The key in my hand burned hotter, its glow matching the light of the creature's eyes. "Why me?" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure in the void tilted its massive head, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "You opened the way." "I didn't know," I cried. "I didn't know what I was doing." The whispers faltered for a moment, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The creature leaned closer, its immense form looming over me. And when it spoke, its voice wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. "Ignorance does not absolve you." The key pulsed violently, and the doorway beneath me began to expand, the edges of the void creeping outward, consuming the floorboards. The room was vanishing, swallowed by the light and the darkness at once, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I clutched the key tighter, the pain in my hand forgotten as the pull of the doorway dragged me to the edge. The creature's massive eyes bore into me, unblinking, unyielding. And then, just as I felt myself slipping, the whispers changed. They weren't commands anymore. They were pleas. "Keep it closed." The voices were different, softer, desperate, as though they were coming from somewhere deep within the void. They overlapped with the creature's roar, creating a discordant, deafening clash that made my head spin. The key pulsed again, and I realized I had a choice. I could turn the key and close the doorway, or I could let it stay open and let them through. The light dimmed slightly, just enough for me to see the shapes writhing within the void. Dozens of them, hundreds, each one a twisted mass of shadow and light. They were waiting. The key pulsed in my hand like a living thing, its heat radiating up my arm. The doorway below churned with chaos, the swirling shadows and light growing more violent with each passing second. The massive figure loomed over me, its glowing eyes unblinking. The whispers split again, a cacophony of overlapping voices. "Turn the key." And then, from deep within the void, the other voice came again, softer, desperate. "Close it, before it's too late." I was frozen, my legs trembling, my hand clutching the key, so tightly I could feel the edges cutting into my palm. My uncle's face flashed in my mind, the memory of his hollow eyes in that vision. He had tried to seal this door. I looked down at the symbol etched into the floor. The lines glowed fiercely, the pattern constantly shifting and reshaping itself as if it were alive. The shapes seemed to ripple in response to my thoughts, urging me toward the edge. "I don't understand," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of it all. "What is this? Why me?" The massive figure leaned closer, the air around it distorting as its form shifted and stretched. Its voice rumbled like a thunderclap. "You are the vessel. The key was given. The door is yours to open." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." The softer voice came again, rising above the chaos. "You must seal it before it consumes you." The key in my hand grew heavier, its glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. I could feel its pull, an invisible force drawing me toward the edge of the doorway. I teetered on the brink, staring into the swirling void below. The figures within were clearer now, countless shapes writhing and reaching, their forms grotesque and impossible. And yet, they seemed trapped, held back by some unseen barrier. The massive figure raised its jagged arm, pointing toward the doorway. "Turn the key. Open the way." The pull of the doorway grew stronger, and I felt my feet sliding closer to the edge. The whispers were deafening now, the voices clashing and overlapping in a chaotic storm. I looked down at the key, the brass surface now glowing so brightly it felt like it would shatter. My uncle's words echoed in my mind. "Do not enter unless it calls to you." The choice was clear, but impossible. If I turned the key, I would open the doorway completely. If I didn't, the weight of it, the whispers, the pull, the unbearable pressure might destroy me. The massive figure loomed closer, its voice booming, "Choose." And beneath it, the softer voice whispered once more, "Seal it." In it, I raised the key, my hand trembling as the void surged around me. The key burned in my hand, the heat searing into my palm like fire. My body trembled under the weight of the voices, one commanding, one pleading, each pulling me in opposite directions. The massive figure in the void leaned closer, its immense, shifting form blotting out everything else. The glowing eyes pierced through the chaos, unblinking, unrelenting. "Turn the key," it roared, its voice a thunderous drumbeat in my chest. But the softer voice rose again, fragile but determined. "Seal it. In it now." I looked down at the key, the light from its surface flickering erratically. The swirling void beneath me pulsed, the shadows within growing more frantic, their twisted forms writhing and clawing toward the edges of the doorway. The weight of the choice bore down on me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt. "I don't know what to do." I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what's right." The softer voice whispered again, soothing but firm. "The door is not meant to open. You must seal it, as he tried before you." The memory of my uncle flashed in my mind again, his hunched figure carving the symbol into the floor, the desperation in his hollow eyes. He had tried to keep this doorway closed, but something had gone wrong. The massive figure in the void shifted, its glowing eyes narrowing. Its voice was colder now, sharper. "He failed. Do not follow him. Open the way." The whispers around me rose to a fever pitch, the voices weaving together into an incomprehensible storm. The key in my hand pulsed violently, its light growing brighter, hotter. And then, in an instant of clarity, I knew what I had to do. I raised the key, my hand trembling as I turned it toward the edge of the doorway. The glowing lines beneath me surged with light, their patterns twisting and writhing as if alive. The massive figure let out a deafening roar. "Do not seal it." But I ignored the command. I closed my eyes, gripping the key tightly, and plunged it into the center of the symbol. The moment the key connected with the glowing lines, the doorway erupted with light. The swirling void recoiled, the shapes within it twisting and writhing as they were pulled back into the darkness. The massive figure let out a guttural scream, its form fracturing and dissolving as the light consumed it. The whispers faltered, their chaotic rhythm breaking apart into fragments. The air around me grew heavier, colder, and the light from the doorway began to fade. I twisted the key, feeling a surge of resistance as the symbol beneath me locked into place. The room shuddered violently, the walls cracking and groaning under the strain. And then, With a final burst of light, the doorway sealed. The glowing lines vanished, leaving only the rough, splintered floorboards beneath my feet. The whispers were gone. The massive figure was gone. I collapsed to the ground, the key slipping from my hand and landing with a dull clatter. The room was silent. For the first time since I had opened the door, I was completely, utterly alone. I sat on the cold floor, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The room around me was quiet, unnaturally so. The oppressive whispers, the churning void, the impossible weight of the doorway. They were all gone, leaving only the faint groan of the house settling around me. The key lay on the floor beside me, its once bright surface now dull and lifeless. I stared at it, my fingers aching from gripping it so tightly. "It's over," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The room still felt wrong. The air was heavy, tinged with the faint scent of burning metal, and the walls seemed to lean inward, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I pushed myself to my feet, swaying slightly as the floorboards creaked beneath me. The symbol on the floor was gone, the intricate lines and patterns erased as though they had never existed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. My uncle's warning echoed in my mind. "Do not enter unless it calls to you." Why had it called to me? Why had I been the one to open the door, to seal it again? I couldn't shake the image of him in the vision, desperate, broken, carving the symbol into the floor with trembling hands. He had known what lay beyond that door. He had tried to stop it, and he had failed. I turned to where the door should have been. The smooth wall was still there, unbroken, as though the doorway had never existed. I pressed my hand against the cold surface, my heart sinking as I realized what that meant. The door wasn't gone. It was waiting. I picked up the key, its weight heavier than it should have been, and slipped it into my pocket. My hand brushed against something else. Folded paper, crinkled and worn. Frowning, I pulled it out. It was another note, the ink faint and faded, written in my uncle's shaky handwriting. "The seal will not hold forever. The key is the only way to stop it. Pass it on before it's too late." My stomach turned. Pass it on? To who? The house groaned again, louder this time, and the faintest trace of a whisper brushed against my ear. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The shadows cast by the narrow window stretched long and jagged across the walls, flickering slightly as if they were alive. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "It is never over." I clutched the note in one hand and the key in the other, my mind spinning. The whisper was faint, but it was there, threading through the silence like a needle. "It is never over," it repeated, soft and insistent. "No," I said aloud, though my voice wavered. "It's done. I sealed it." The room didn't respond. It didn't need to. The weight of the air, the subtle chill creeping into my bones, told me the truth. My uncle's warning wasn't just a caution. It was a curse. I stuffed the note into my pocket and stumbled toward the smooth wall where the door had been. My hands ran over its surface, searching for any trace of the frame, the keyhole, anything that might prove it was gone for good. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding wood. The whispers grew louder, weaving together in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. They weren't chaotic this time. They were deliberate. "It will return." "No!" I shouted, slamming my fist against the wall. "I won't let it." The house creaked, the floorboards beneath me groaning as if in protest. The shadows on the walls stretched further, twisting and curling into shapes I couldn't quite make out. I turned toward the window, desperate for air, for light, for anything that felt real. But outside, the world was cloaked in darkness. The forest beyond the house was gone, swallowed by a thick, impenetrable fog. And then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, maybe more, standing motionless in the fog. Their forms were indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but their hollow eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. They were watching. The key in my pocket pulsed, faint but steady, its weight dragging me back to the center of the room. My uncle's note burned in my mind. "Pass it on before it's too late. Pass it on." But to who? I turned away from the window, my chest tightening. The room felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, the air pressing against my lungs. The whispering rose again, louder and more chaotic, filling my thoughts with an overwhelming certainty. The key was a curse. The seal was only temporary, and I was the next keeper. The door might be gone, but it wasn't over. Not for me, not for whoever came after. The whispering softened, fading into the background, and the figures in the fog disappeared. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but I knew it wouldn't last. I walked to the center of the room and stared down at the spot where the symbol had been. The floor was smooth now, unmarked, but I could feel the energy pulsing beneath it, waiting. I slipped the key back into my pocket and left the room, locking the memory of it behind me. But as I descended the creaking stairs, a single, chilling thought echoed in my mind. The door wasn't gone. It was waiting for the next call.